There's a lot going on in the country the last couple of days. It all started Monday, I believe it was, with the killing of George Floyd by a cop who seemed to use obviously unjustifiable force against a man, cutting off blood flow to his brain and killing him. And since then, the understandable and justifiable protests have devolved into rioting, looting, and then arson. And then that process has spread all across the country. It even came to Tampa last night, not more than 10 minutes from where I live, where we had protests, rioting, looting, and then arson. Some of you with good memories may be able to remember the Baltimore events in the spring of 2015, when you had another black man who died in the hands of the police. There were questions about what had happened, and there were the, perfectly legitimate and understandable protests, which then devolved into rioting, looting, and arson. On Facebook at the time, I well remember that I was posting a political point, which is basically what this video is as well. And what was my political point? My political point was reminding people that similar circumstances in 1968 had helped elect Richard Nixon. Now, this was in the spring of 2015. Donald Trump wasn't even a candidate yet. This had nothing to do with Trump. But I was making the argument that what was happening in Baltimore would make it more likely, don't think I said it, and will ensure a victory of, but more likely, it would make more likely a victory of whoever the Republicans were running against whoever the Democrats ran, which ended up to be Hillary Clinton. Although at that point, that wasn't even clear either. 1968 and the riots in 19 were something, I had lived through. I lived in Philadelphia at the time, and my father was a police officer, and he was involved in, countering what was going on back in 1968 in Philadelphia. I remember him going off to work and, watch him check his trunk to make sure he had all his riot gear, his helmet, his baton, his shield, all the other things they wore back in the 1960s to deal with unruly mobs of people, which is what was going on. He didn't talk about what went on, but I remember one day we got our paper, the Evening Bulletin, which no longer is in publication. It would come, the paper boy would deliver it, somewhere after school, because most of the paper boys were school kids. And I remember going through it, and there was a picture of my father and another guy, two men, on the steps of a church, a black church in North Philadelphia, with their batons out, no guns drawn, surrounded by a mob, an unruly mob. And this picture was taken from a vantage point of like a window in a nearby building by some reporter. And my mother had the paper out, and she was crying because she said, "Oh my God, your father, he's going to get killed." And I remember talking to my dad. I said, what had happened? And what had happened was, it was interesting in and of itself. They received a call from a black church, a Protestant church, that they were afraid their place was going to be looted. So they asked for police help. So they sent my father and another guy down there, and they went in and they talked to the minister, and he explained the problem, and they said, yeah, sure, they'd stand outside and try to keep the people away. But they also called for backup because the mob was getting bigger, and there were only two of them. And, they didn't want to get in a position where they had to draw their weapons to, preserve their own lives. So they called for backup, and they agreed to stand outside in front of the doors. And he said the thing was, when they got out there, they heard the doors lock, that the minister locked the doors behind them. So there they were on the steps of a church. They couldn't get back into the church. But and they were surrounded by all these people, and they're just praying as hard as they could that backup arrived to break up the crowd before it was 2 against hundreds, or a position where they'd have to draw their weapons to try to defend themselves. I should add about my father. My father was a sharpshooter. He had a sharpshooter badge. He was a good shot, but he was very proud of the fact that when he retired, back in the, I guess it was the 70s, late 70s. He had never, not only had he never shot anybody, he had never killed anybody, he had never shot anybody, he had never drawn his weapon at all, other than on a shooting range. In all those years, 50s, 60s, 70s, that he was a policeman, he never had to use his weapon, not even as a tool to pull out and try to scare somebody. I mean, he just never used it. The only thing he had ever used was a blackjack or a baton. And he was proud of that fact. The last thing, he'd been through World War II. The last thing he wanted to do was to come home and kill somebody. But what happened after 1968 was, and it's not the only reason Richard Nixon was elected in November 1968, but I think it was part of the reason, and I think many other people do too. Remember, Nixon ran as a law and order president. Why was law and order a rallying cry politically in this country? It was because of what had happened in 1968. There seemed to be a breakdown of law and order, which made it easier for Nixon to win. And as I said, I'm not saying that's the only reason Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, but I do think it was part of the reason. And what I was arguing on Facebook in 2015 was that this breakdown, seeming breakdown of law and order in Baltimore and a few other places, would make it easier, would contribute to the victory of a Republican candidate in November 2016, which it did. And again, I'm not saying what happened in Baltimore is the only reason that Donald Trump became president of the United States, but I think it was a contributory factor. And my point here is that what's going on in not just Minneapolis, but in all the other cities that it spread to. You know, I've seen Philadelphia, New York, Phoenix, Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, Tampa here last night, L.A., Wilmington, Delaware. If you look at all that's going on, you know, what's the impact going to be? I mean, does anybody in their right mind think that this is going to help a Democrat get elected in November 2020? I don't think so. Now, I'm not saying that this will ensure Donald Trump will become president for a second term in November 2020. There's lots of other things that are, we still have this pandemic to get through. There are other things that can happen with China, with Iran, terrorism. There's any number of things that could happen. It's still a long way till November. But I think, in the psyche of the American voter, this is something that will help Donald Trump be reelected. And the longer this continues, the more help there'll be. You can already see Trump positioning himself as the law and order candidate. You can already see, you see it in the media, especially MSNBC and CNN. You see it with Biden, even with Obama. Nobody wants to come out and call these things anything but protests. The average American watching, TV, reading the press, knows what a protest is. Protest is people protesting. When you start seeing looting, and then you start seeing arson, it's hard to consider those as protests. I'm not saying it's impossible. I mean, obviously, there are people on the left who continue to call them protests. I watched MSNBC and CNN last night, and, as in the background, you see things burning, you see flames, you see people coming out of a store carrying, whatever they just looted from the store. And here's this CNN reporter calling this is a protest. And it's just not, it's just not my conception of protests, and I don't think it is of most people. And it's fine for CNN and MSNBC to take that editorial line if that's what they want to do. And I'm sure there's loads of people who, wouldn't vote for Trump anyway, who will like to keep these things labeled protest rather than, looting and arson. But for the rest of the people, there are going to be people in this country who will see two things. I mean, I don't know if it's going to get Trump reelected, but I know one thing we will see. There will be increased gun sales after this is all over. I mean, we know that's what's going to happen because it always happens. people will buy more guns. Which, and if you think guns are a problem, that means that problem with guns is going to get more significant. We know that's going to happen. It always does. There will be people who will run to the gun store as soon as they reopen and arm up. There will be people who put up security systems. There'll be a big bump in security system sales. That's what it's going to be. And those people, if, maybe you could say, well, they would have voted for Trump anyway. But there are a lot of people, when you look at the polls, there are a lot of people who still don't know what they're going to do. There are a lot of people who, don't like Trump, but don't necessarily like what's going on with the Democrats. I mean, if you look at the polls of Democrats, even a good proportion of Democrats don't like what's happening in their party. There are loads of Democrats who aren't happy with Joe Biden as the candidate. So I'm not saying that these disgruntled leftists are going to come out and vote for Donald Trump, but it's those people in the center, the people who haven't made up their mind. I believe large numbers of them will become more likely to vote for Donald Trump the longer this goes on. And that's going to be the impact of this. So just as I argued back in 2015 that in many ways what was happening in Baltimore was helping to ensure a Republican victory in November 2016, I think what's happening today is very likely to ensure Trump's reelection. And, that's my 2 cents. If you enjoy these videos, I would just, ask you, as I have before, to give it a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe to my channel, and also you can, hit the little bell, the notification button, so you'll be notified when I post new videos in the future. So thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of this, and see you next time.